we're hearing a lot from outside of China about the need for an independent investigation, especially as to the source of COVID-19. What is Beijing saying? What level of transparency is there about drilling down to whether this was from a wet market or possibly accidentally leaked from a laboratory?
I think Beijing has always been insisting very publicly that it has been transparent during this process, and it especially relies on that relationship with the World Health Organization, the WHO, saying it's been working with them from the early days of this virus. It's had people here to inspect its work, and that they would say the WHO hasn't found any fault with them, and therefore they've done what they need to do in terms of international institutions. Now, clearly that's not enough for a lot of people around the world. The US in particular, Donald Trump, president, railing against the WHO and what it says is an overly cozy role with China. And hence you get these calls for an independent investigation on the ground here. I mean, I think, frankly, that's not going to happen. The Chinese side have been saying from day one that, we need to be scientific about where this came from. At the same time, they're not going to let scientific investigators in because that's simply not how it works. They want control, and that's been evident in their response to the whole sort of crisis, especially the media side of it, where people who've been out there reporting have now been kept under detention. So it's very, very hard to know exactly what has been going on. But they say when it comes to the WHO, other institutions, they fulfill their duties to them, and therefore they don't have a need really to invite independent investigators in.
Yeah, well, we've seen how slow and weak the WHO has been on this. They're trying to make up ground now, I suppose, so people worry about the extent of their visibility here. But what does Beijing say then at this stage is the source? Apart from Wuhan, do they have clarity, certainty, or is it something they're still investigating?
Well, they wouldn't even say that Wuhan is the clear source of this. I mean, what we saw earlier, a few weeks ago now, was a spokesman for the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs going on Twitter to suggest perhaps this virus came from the US and it was taken to Wuhan by US soldiers. Perhaps it emerged in Italy. There was this sort of attempt to deflect it and say we don't even know for sure it started in Wuhan. I think the overwhelming evidence from what we know so far is that this initial outbreak was in Wuhan, and that's the likelier source. Scientists around the world talking about the wet markets and the idea that wild animals sold in them, because wet markets in themselves aren't necessarily a source for viruses. It's the idea of exotic animals living cheek by cheek in cramped confinement, which is the real problem. And as a result, China has banned that sort of trade. It's been taken years to do it, but as a result of this epidemic, it has passed laws to try and get rid of that. But they wouldn't,
which is kind of strange, isn't it? Yeah, deny that they are the source of the virus, but close them down anyway, or at least say they're going to close them down. It sort of underscores exactly why people say we need an independent outside inquiry, of course, with the cooperation of China. Yet the way Beijing has slapped down our Home Affairs Minister and Foreign Minister for suggesting such an inquiry is very strident. They've accused them of being part of a US propaganda campaign against China, which is very strident language against such a strong trading partner and strong supporter of China as Australia is. Is that a common response on this issue in Beijing at the moment?
Yeah, I think you're right. That sort of aggressive response is becoming more common. They call it the wolf warrior diplomacy, which is named after a very sort of gung-ho, patriotic military film released in China, very popular here, nowhere else in the world, really. And this idea of fighting back against criticism is something that seems to be embedded, especially among the younger generation of diplomats who perhaps feel that for a long time China was too meek. You remember the old sort of Deng Xiaoping, the former sort of leader of China, saying, hide your strength, bide your time. They don't think there's any point really in hiding their strength, biding their time anymore, and they want to push back. Because from the Chinese point of view, again, I mean, if you think back to the early days of this outbreak, you did have President Trump praising President Xi Jinping for China's handling of this coronavirus. And it didn't become an issue until obviously it landed on Western shores and became a huge, huge problem. According to the official figures, at least much more of a problem than it ever was in China. And at that point, you did see attempts and anger from sort of the US side to say, well, this is because of this is China's fault. And I think China feels like it has been politicized as a result, and they want to push back on that. But then that leads to other reactions. I think the UK was, pretty balanced when it came to its views on China. But when when these spokespeople started saying perhaps it started in the US, perhaps it started in Italy, I think that really, really angered a lot of people around the world. This sort of trying to shift the blame and only intensified that. But I think when we have to think about this is, right, so if we do want an international team on the ground, what's the best way of achieving that? And where Beijing is right now, I'm not sure they're ever really going to allow anyone, especially if they see it as part of a political process. So what is the best way of achieving transparency and accountability? It's really, really hard to say.
It is a big question.
Not responding to this sort of concerted pressure we're seeing. I mean, in the UK, I'm not sure about Australia, but people have talked about the idea of reparations coming from China. People saying, China should be made to pay for this. Again, something the Chinese Foreign Ministry has pushed back against very strongly, saying, well, the US never had to pay reparations for the great financial crisis of 2008. Why should China?
Yeah, well, sorry to interrupt, Tom, but I think that is a pointless debate. That is never going to happen. We might get an investigation. That's worth fighting for, but I don't think reparations are ever going to happen. I just want to get from you, while I've got time, something on North Korea. Now, nobody really knows what's going on in North Korea, but if anybody has a handle on what's happening in Pyongyang, of course, it is Beijing. What is the latest advice there? Do you believe that Kim Jong-un is ill, is sick, is dying? What's happening to the leader there and, in fact, the leadership of the country?
Well, yeah, the official word from the Chinese Communist Party, their liaison office with North Korea, is that nothing has changed. There's no new intelligence that they're aware of to suggest that. And of course, they do have very strong ties, China and North Korea, and they probably have a better relationship than anyone else. When Kim Jong-un started making his way in the diplomatic world, he came to China first, and he's always gone to meet President Xi Jinping. But as you say, it is very hard to know what's going on in North Korea at the best of times, especially in these COVID-19 times. They were one of the first countries to completely shut their border. Diplomats there, journalists there have not been there for the last sort of few weeks. So it's very, very hard to know what's going on. I think it just sort of shows how worrying these things can be. What we do know is obviously that Kim Jong-un did miss that big celebration, April the 15th, his grandfather's birthday, not just his grandfather's birthday, but a huge celebration as the founding father of North Korea. And there's a dynastic dictatorship, so that is important for him to be there. The fact that he wasn't, and also the fact he's, visibly unhealthy. He's about 5'7", 21 stone, smokes like a chimney. There's always going to be this sort of speculation. But right now, we don't know. Just one thing to remember is back in 2014, I think, Kim Jong-un also disappeared. He disappeared for 40 days, then he reappeared, and Korean state media said he'd had some physical discomfort. I think that's what we're going to potentially see here. There might be appearance in future. Otherwise, all bets are off.